The Archons of Genshin Impact are supposed to be the elder statesmen of their respective elements, seeing as they're the ones who are meant to be the strongest out of all who wield their power, or if direct combat is out of their purview, then some mystical force separating them from a typical vision holder. Translating this into video game context, prevailing wisdom dictates they should be the strongest character of each element, or at the very least excel at a function that epitomizes the element in question to the fullest. Granted, ludonarrative harmony is habitually ignored so as not to force players into a set pace or playstyle and allow them to progress however they see fit, but in a game such as Genshin where every character has their own established identity, background, appearance, playstyle, and personality far beyond what is expected from a gacha title, the closer they adhere a unit's in-game strength to their potential in combat based on the lore, the better. So far that appears to be the case. Zhongli, Shogun, and Nahida are by and large the strongest of their respective elements, and though Venti's status has been in decline ever since the advent of Kazuha and Sucrose's rise to prominence, underrating his amazing strength would be a disservice. While Venti, Zhongli, and Nahida have for the most part flown solo, Shogun has spent much of her years outside her self-imposed prison accompanied by a familiar, the ever-charming Yae Miko. Miko's involvement in Inuzuma's story, as well as her ostensible indifference to a lot of terrible events, leads many to believe her power is considerable, narratively speaking. Her bluntness towards everyone, including A, suggests the latter respects her enough to view her as an equal, and her coy and mischievous demeanor has made her a consummate fan favorite among the player base. Everyone was interested in seeing what Shogun's friend had to offer if she would be as good as the Electro Archon herself. Unfortunately, such hype would fall flat. While her animations, design, and gameplay mechanics were very well thought out, in practice they came with a lot of issues, rendering players divided on just how good she really is. Over time, it felt like she just fell out of public attention, extremely strange for a character whose widespread appeal rivals that of the Archons. So for today's video, I thought it would be cool to go through Miko's history to find out what happened to her. All things considered, Miko had everything going for her in terms of what is necessary to be a why everyone plays character. If we think about units like Ganyu, Kazuha, Shogun, Zhongli, there were so many shared factors between them and her that it's quite perplexing for things to turn out the way they did. For starters, it would be no exaggeration to say her character appeal at times felt like it exceeded that of her own mistress, Raiden Shogun. She's of the Kimono Mimi archetype, being a kitsune turned into human, and anime fans go crazy for that kind of stuff. She's got this unapologetic sense of charm and cunning, and very heavily gives off the big sister Ara vibes that would make any tier 3 simp give up No Nut November. And as stated before, it's heavily implied she's got the power to back up her attitude. It's as if you took the gentleness of Ganyu, the cold shoulder of Eula, the opulence of Ningguang, and the flirtatiousness of Lisa, put them all together and you get Miko. Case in point, she's objectively very attractive to the vast majority of Genshin's player base, and it shows. Her banner sales, while not the most impressive in regards to single characters, is a very respectable showing, falling just short of Ganyu's first run. There were a lot of players who really wanted to try her out, but that's also what presented the first problem in her career. As a result of Miko's reputation preceding her, the player base set their expectations of her impossibly high, believing she would be on the same caliber as Shogun when in reality she was more like Beidou in relative in-game power scaling. Expectations play a significant role in determining how a character is perceived. Even if they're objectively a strong character, if the community doesn't share that perspective, that character will not be well received. Hence why Kokomi had such an abysmal time during early version 2. As they say, first impressions are lasting impressions. To better explain this, we should look at how she's meant to be played. Miko primarily handles off-field damage. Off-fielders are well liked for being able to exert pressure without having to take up your active slot, since only one unit can be up front at a time. This also means there's a higher chance of them being used on account of there being 3 slots for them to compete over instead of just 1 for on-fielders or main DPS. Part of why Fischl is so disgustingly overpowered is that not only does she apply Electro very consistently, but she doesn't even have to be the active party member to do so. And by version 2.5, when Miko came out, the taser composition was a household name. There were already 2 off-field DPSers that she would have to handle, but considering they were both 4 stars, the idea of a 5-star off-fielder looked very promising. Miko's class, so to speak, is the second reason why I felt like things are going so well for her. Off-field DPS is probably the most dominant class right now, as their persistent effects make them more flexible for other team compositions. Miko's persistent effect came in the form of her skill, Sessho Sakura. She had 3 charges. Using one would have her dash forward and leave behind a totem at her previous spot. The totem would automatically target one nearby opponent with electro damage, and if there are other totems nearby, the damage would increase. Considering the duration of each totem is 14 seconds while the cooldown was only 4, she would be able to maintain 3 totems indefinitely and reposition them on demand more or less. Initially, this sounds very familiar to Fischl's elemental skill, where Oz would periodically attack the nearest target with Electro, only with more steps. Miko's totems had more damage per strike at higher levels, but given each one only attacks 5 times in their 14-second duration, whereas Oz can strike basically per second, individually speaking it came off as a downgrade. However, one weakness Fischl has is that her burst isn't really that much of a burst. Most people consider Fischl to have 2 elemental skills. Miko, on the other hand, does have a burst, Great Secret Art Tenko Kenshin, a screen nuke in front of her that deals massive electro damage. If there are any nearby totems, they're consumed, causing follow-up attacks for a total of 4 lightning bolts, and if you combine all of them together at rank 10, you're staring down just over 2200% in damage. Her first Ascension passive would allow her to reset the cooldown of however many totems were used up, allowing you to instantly replace the totems that were lost and repeat the cycle again once your burst comes off cooldown. This was supposed to separate her from the likes of Fischl, an off-fielder who could swap in, do big damage, and swap back out right away. But therein lies the first major problem that people found with her. There are more things Miko has to do. Off-fielders are meant to switch in, press 1 or 2 buttons, and get out. Xingqiu swaps in, uses burst and skill, then swaps out and waits to do it again. Shanlin comes in, drops Guoba, then spin to wins and gets out. The goal is to take up as little time as possible. Assuming her burst is online, Miko would have to swap in, use her skill 3 times, then use her burst, and then have to use her skill 3 more times. This eats up considerably more time than other off-fielders, and while the average player likely doesn't care too much about optimizing every possible second in their rotation, that can disrupt your combo plays, especially for units with time-sensitive buffs. Essentially, Miko suffered from a similar issue as Lisa, and honestly a lot of Catalyst users, where trying to use her simply felt uncomfortable. Her most significant issue was that she took slightly too long to do her stuff, but that alone could have been worked around. Her damage numbers are still very impressive, but being unable to easily access that damage diminished how good it was. Miko also ran into a lot of other quality of life issues. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail to conserve time, but Ark Revner made a good video on that a while back if you want to check it out. So to paraphrase a few of the big ones, long field time exposes her to a lot of potential damage, and without a shield user protecting her, being staggered even once can throw you off completely. Her attack animations along with her skill and burst make playing her as an on-fielder quite unpleasant. I'm pretty sure her charge attack is the longest animation in the game, and the scaling isn't good enough to warrant it, nor can she weave it in with a normal attack pattern like Yanfei. She's the only character in Genshin with a 90 energy cost 22 second cooldown burst. Shogun also has a 90 cost burst, but it's an 18 second cooldown, and she has no trouble getting her burst up for obvious reasons. What sucks is that Miko's first constellation effectively slashes the 90 cost burst down to below 70, which feels like a waste of a constellation. It's not like her burst is the strongest out there. For comparison, Ayaka's burst does over 4000% on its own and requires no prior setup. Even worse is Miko's Constellation 2, which expands her attack range by 60% and allows her to achieve her max damage level on totems, something not accessible otherwise. These issues gave off this nagging feeling that Miko's base form was incomplete, whether intentionally or not. Once again, she has a very interesting concept, but the execution was rather sloppy, almost as if there was no quality assurance testing. MiHoYo would press the narrative of not thinking things through even further in version 2.6, where a supposed quality of life change altered the way her totems targeted enemies, resulting in a massive indirect nerf for Miko's efficiency. They would ultimately revert the change back, but the damage was already done. Overhype, clunky moveset, and a PR mistake from MiHoYo led to many being disillusioned by her, but unlike say Kokomi or Shinobu, whose capabilities were hard-locked, all of Miko's problems weren't insurmountable, being quality of life concerns, not so much attributes. Yes, Miko's rotation takes more field time and button presses than most are comfortable with. Yes, Miko feels hamstrung without Constellations 1 and 2 to some extent. Yes, she has an unreasonably long cooldown and energy cost to her burst in spite of it being weaker than lower cost and cooldown bursts, but most if not all of those problems were experiential. To be fair, quality of life matters a lot, and characters who lack it suffer tremendously in performance when they would have been fantastic otherwise. Honestly, if we just made it so Miko didn't have to replace her totems after using her burst, she would instantly become so much better. But my point is, she still had her damage potential and Electro application, there just needed to be an opportunity for her to circumvent those restrictions. Just like with Shinobu, that opportunity would arrive when Dendro was brought in. The premise behind Miko's increased usability echoes a lot of why Shinobu was made better, but for a different reason. Shinobu can work with Catalyze into Aggravate, but she's more suited for Hyper Bloom. Miko, on the other hand, excels very much in Aggravate teams, and being an off-fielder means she's the best candidate to use in tandem with Fischl for the strongest Catalyze-centric team right now. I forget exactly what it's called, but prior to version 2, the breakdown was Tignari, Miko, Fischl, and some auxiliary unit, Kasuha, Zhongli, what have you. With the release of Nahida came a new level of Dendro application and utility far surpassing Tignari, thus making it way easier for you to apply Dendro at a rate that matches Electro application. None of this really addressed Miko's internal issues, but Dendro was able to solve an external problem that affected both her and Shinobu, replaceability. Due to Dendro mandating a heavy concentration of Electro and Dendro damage, it rendered Sucrose unable to commandeer the role of Electro damage as freely as she would like. Shinobu and Miko had some fringe uses in Taser, with the latter also being effective in tandem with Raiden Shogun's Hypercarry squad. It's just that Miko wasn't as big of an improvement to warrant how much it would cost to use her, making her just shy of a top tier unit, likely because of those quality of life problems. Now to aggravate, Miko finally found a best in slot position, which increases the likelihood of players wanting to use her, and remember, she's an off-fielder. That automatically makes her more enticing than an on-fielder like Kuching. One more thing that finally caught up to us was Miko's other Ascension passive. In the beginning, a lot of players considered this to be a dead passive. The damage from her totems would increase by 15% for every 100 points of elemental mastery she had. Not necessarily a pointless talent per se, but there was no practical reason to run EM on her solely for that. If say it was a more universal conversion like EM boosting Electro damage, then you have every reason to do so. Now that we have the Dendro element though, the incentive to grab some EM on her is very much worth it, as you don't have to be concerned about her own damage, instead focusing on reactions. Speaking of hyperscaling, that was another circumstantial positive for her. Her Ascension stat is crit rate, and Kagura's Verity substat is crit damage. Getting a reasonable amount of crit rate and damage and elemental mastery on her is a possibility, granting you the best of both worlds. She may not be as fluid in gameplay as Fischl, but she's somewhat made up for that in power, albeit with a lot of investment. Actually, the debate between Miko and Fischl has always been kinda strange to me. If we look at them fundamentally, I can see why players would compare them against each other. Both are off-fielder Electro DPSers with a high rate of application, and they do so by instantiating a singularity. However, there's no rule saying you can't use two characters to do the same thing in the same party. In fact, having two characters with very similar playstyles should be a good thing. After all, what could be worse than a giant paint bubble? Oh, I know, two giant paint bubbles. Or in the context of Spiral Abyss, you can have one aggravate team with Fischl and another with Miko, so having copies should only ever be seen as a good thing when it comes to off-field damage. One more thing, because I know people will point it out if I don't mention it, but another indirect buff to Miko was the new artifact set, Gilded Dreams, a very solid choice for Miko in Dendro comps. I wouldn't say it's the best choice, kind of the same situation as Kokomi with the Ocean Clan versus Tenacity. It's pick your poison, but more options means more versatility. Version 3 has graciously buffed Electro as a whole by finally rewarding its units who value quantity over quality, as well as give them a leading role in the play and not a background cast member. Unlike Shinobu though, who received a substantial indirect buff, Miko didn't change all that much. That's because just like Kokomi, she was always good. It's that players zeroed in too much on her flaws to realize they all had workarounds. In their defense, I don't blame them. We've gotten to a point where most players are content with mentally AFKing through all the game's combat, so autopilot team comps like Raiden National, Hu Tao Double Hydro, or Freeze are well liked on the basis of how easy they are to use. In contrast, trying to circumvent Miko's long animations, extended field time, and restrictive gameplay felt like too much work, especially when the benefit wasn't that much better than any other choice like Fischl, Beidou, or Shogun. But now Miko does have a team composition where overcoming those obstacles is worth it thanks to her best in slot status on arguably the strongest Electro Dendro team in the game. I'm not saying she's this super crazy tier 0 meta shattering unit, but she offers a ton of damage flexibility. She was already a good choice in strong teams like Shogun Hypercarry and Kokomi Taser, but with all attention currently focused on Dendro, being part of a meta catalyzed or bloom team does wonders for your PR. It might lead to a lot of players dusting off their Mikos that they dropped her and bringing her back into the forefront. That being said, I personally believe her increasing success may not last. The internal issues plaguing her design are still present and honestly completely unnecessary. Constellation 1 and 2 should really be part of her base kit, and again, I don't get why her burst uses up all her totems when for other summon-centric talents like Kokomi's Jellyfish or Fischl's Oz, using their burst refreshes the duration, not consumes it. While off-field damage dealers benefit from a ton of privileges, they do suffer from one drawback: it's easy to replace them. Miko doesn't have anything that sets her apart from other characters besides damage. Shinobu is presently the only half-decent Electro healer, no disrespect to Dori fans. Miko is just damage. That means the moment we get another Electro off-field damage dealer, if they're more comfy to play and achieve the same result as Miko, then she will lose her spot. Fortunately for her, that's a very high bar to meet, so I think she'll be safe for a while. Anyways, what do you guys think about Yae Miko's newfound potential? Do you think her internal problems are still too big of a detriment, or has she found the same anime redemption arc as the likes of Shinobu and Kokomi? Feel free to share in the comments. For now, if you enjoyed the video, it would be awesome if you left a like and subscribed. Consider following me on Twitter at Vars, joining my Discord server, and if you'd like to support me further, check out my Patreon. By donating, you get access to benefits across all three of my channels: Vars, Vars2, and Vars3. Till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.